So let's get a single recipe on the recipe detail page. Now to get it, we need the recipe ID, right? Because in get recipe, we do require the ID. Now conveniently, we get that ID as a dynamic segment on our path here. So on recipe detail page, we just need to extract that. And for this, we can use a default Angular strategy where we get information about the activated route. You do inject this from @AngularRouter is where you need to import the activated route. And this is an object which you can use in ng init to then have a look at your param map, which is a complex name, but which in the end means a map of all the parameters this route receives. And parameters are these dynamic URL segments. Now, this is not an object with all these segments. Instead, it's a so-called observable. Now, observables are a concept heavily embraced by Angular, as you probably know, and we'll use it a lot in this course. Attached, you find some resources to get you started with observables in case you never heard about them. Here, I do expect you to know the basics about them. Observables are basically objects you can subscribe to get data. Either one-time data, like when you're sending an HTTP request, or multiple times if you subscribe to something which emits new data every X seconds or whenever a user clicks somewhere or something like this. This observable here will emit new data whenever our dynamic segments change, even if we are still on the same page, but they somehow change because we have a button that changes them. In subscribe, we pass in a function that will execute when we receive new data, and that function will get a param map object, and this now actually is the object where we can retrieve our parameters from. So first of all, I can check if this param map does not have recipe ID as a parameter. It should have, because we set it up here, recipe ID. But if it somehow wouldn't have it, which is very unlikely and unrealistic, but if it wouldn't have it, then we want to redirect the user here. We want to make sure the user leaves the page here. And I'll come back to how we can go back programmatically in a second. I will also return here so that no other executes runs after this. If, however, we make it after this check here, which we should in most cases, so we do have a recipe ID, we can extract that. So the recipe ID can be extracted from the param map with a get and then the name of the parameter. Now, obviously, the name here and here, but not this one, but the string names here, have to match the name you set up in your routing configuration without the colon, but the part after the colon. This has to match. So now I'm extracting my ID here, and now we can use the service to load it. So for this, we need to inject our recipes service. Here, recipes service, like this. You need to import that recipes service type from the recipe service file up there. And with it injected there, I can now reach out to my recipe service, get my recipe, and pass that recipe ID I extracted as an argument. Now this will return a single recipe, and to use it in the template, we need to store it in a property of our class here. So I'll name this loaded recipe. You can name it whatever you want. And it will be of type recipe, and it is a good pattern, a good practice to clearly state the type an object will hold. So here I say that this will actually be a recipe or null, but initially it's undefined. But thereafter, once there is data in it, it should be of type recipe. And for that, you need to import recipe from your recipe model. So loaded recipe is now where I can store this recipe I'm retrieving here, like this. And now we can access the loaded recipe data in the template, of course. In the template of the recipe detail page, I want to output the image. For that, I'll remove the padding here. And I can simply add in image and bind its source to my loaded recipe image URL. And below the image here, let me also wrap this into the ion grid actually to control the size of that. So here I have my ion column, and we'll see how we adjust it later. For now, I'll just wrap it in there. Below that, in a new ion row, in a new ion col. You always need to have a column in your rows. There, I want to have a h1 tag with the title. So I'll use string interpolation here and then access loaded recipe title. And if we have a look at the recipe model, then we also have the ingredients. It would be nice to output these as well. And which better component to use than an ion list. So in a new row and column, I'll add my ion list here. And in there, again, we can use ion item with ng4 to go through all the ingredients. So I'll add a loop here, let ig for ingredient of loaded recipe ingredients. This loops through all the ingredients, and I simply output the ingredient name here. ig refers to an element in ingredients, and ingredients is just an array of strings, so we can directly output that here. Okay, nice. So this should work. Now, let's have a look if it works. Remember, the IDs of our recipes are R1 and R2, and therefore, if I manually edit the route here in the app and load /recipes/R1, we should load recipe 1. And here it is. Doesn't look too bad. We can do something about the styling, but it doesn't look too shabby. Now, I actually want to make sure that my title up there doesn't say recipe detail, but actually shows the name of the recipe that was loaded. So here I will output loaded recipe title with string interpolation. You can do this up here too, not just in the content. Of course, you can use the loaded recipe anywhere in this Angular component. And that should be a good first step. And I also want to give my toolbar here a color of primary, also, by the way, in the recipes page. And later in the styling and theming module, I'll also show you how you can generally set all backgrounds of all toolbars to this primary color instead of having to add this manually to every toolbar. But for now, we'll do it manually. And as this app now reloads, this doesn't look too bad. Now let's also center Schnitzel here and make sure that our image here, this column in which it is, has no padding. And for that, you can go back to the recipe detail page. And on the h1 tag, we can center this with the CSS utility attribute text center, which you can learn more about in the official docs, of course, on Ionic Framework under developers, UI components. If you go to the guide and then there under layout, CSS utilities, there you find all these utility attributes you can add. And I don't just want to center the text. On this column, which has my image, I also don't want to have padding around it. So on the column, we can add no padding actually. And that is something you can also learn when you dive into the official grid documentation. This reloads the page. It reduces the padding, but if we inspect it, there still is a little bit of padding around the entire grid. Well, for that, let's copy no padding and add it to the entire grid as well. And now this is gone. I'm quite happy with that progress, but entering the URL by hand is not really how we want our users to work with our app, right? So how can we make sure that when we tap this, we go to the second page?